Okay, now we're going over the hardest part of the EFI upgrade. Stick around. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the garage, and this is basically part 2 of the Holley Sniper EFI upgrade on the 350M Project Smoke Monster. Now, whenever going from carbureted to an EFI setup, you don't necessarily have to replace the tank like we're going to in this situation, but I have a sneaking suspicion that the tank that's in there has a little bit of a leak, and the fuel level sender is not working properly, so you're going to have to drop the tank anyways for no more than what it costs to go ahead and upgrade to a new tank. And this is a Tanks Incorporated tank with a hyperfuel setup. It's worth it just to go ahead and do that and save yourself the time and issue. But before we put this one in, we're going to test a couple things out. And one of them is we're going to make sure that we can get our fuel level. This is the new fuel level sender that comes with the hyper tank setup. A little bit disappointed. This kit is designed for a 69 through 74 Nova, but the fuel level sensor that they send is just a universal unit. Yeah, just a universal unit. It is a 0 to 90, which is the GM setup, but you have to do all the measurements and stuff like that to get the thing to work. I don't even know if the dang thing will fit in there without, there we go. So you can see, yeah, it's way too tall. So we'll have to go through that. Before we do any of that stuff though, we just need to get our fuel level reading into the gauge. And there is the wire back there that goes to the back of the car that ties into the existing fuel level sensor. I don't know if the fuel level sensor is bad, doesn't have a good ground. The way that this works is you've got a output here and then a ground, and then it just makes a resistance loop back to the gauge. So the gauge has to have a good chassis ground along with your fuel level sender, and then as your arm moves, your resistance changes. This is just a potentiometer in here. That's as simple as it gets. But what we can do is get the old tank out of the way, find the existing sending wire, tie it into this, ground the other side of it, just ground the frame of this, and we should be able to move this back and forth and see our fuel level gauge on the dash move. So let's go ahead and get the old tank out of the way. We'll test this out, make sure that we get this sorted out. And then after we do that, we've got to install our fuel pump. Well, I bought the unit that came with the 340, and I decided, let's go ahead and upgrade it right now, because we're going to make enough horsepower with the big block that the 340 would probably support it, but we wouldn't have enough to go beyond much where we are on naturally aspirated. And being that we're sponsored by Nitrous Express, of course, we're going to throw a nitrous kit on this thing eventually. So let's go ahead and upgrade this up. So we're going to go to a 450 liter per hour pump on this before we assemble it. Same ordeal. There will be some assembly required on this where we have to cut this bracket down, do all of our measurements to get our pump in there, because as you can see, this is just kind of a universal kit. And then the only thing that's really specific to the Nova is the tank itself. So might have better luck spending a little bit more money on some of the kits that are out there from other brands that are pre-assembled. This is the cheaper kit. I will say that the tank is a very nice tank though, so it's got that going for it. It is what it is. Okay, so we've got the old tank out. Keep in mind whenever you're doing stuff like this that there's gas fumes, and as somebody that knows somebody that's actually burned their shop down because they were literally doing it during a tank swap, just be safe, be safe, ventilate, etc. Okay, here, let me see. Let's go right here, and I've got our new fuel sender on here. This is just a temporary ground, but this is the factory fuel sender line. Had the push on tip on there, and the old sender, I hooked onto it and it was getting a reading, so I'm not sure what was going on with it. Maybe it didn't have a good ground. The tank grounding on the old one actually had a wire going down to the twist ring or the lock ring on the, well, I guess it's a pickup. It's not, it'd be what you'd call a fuel pump, but it's a pickup on the older tanks because it's just a tube for the mechanical pump to pull. So that thing may have not had good continuity. Ground is critical whenever dealing with any kind of analog signals. It's critical on all automotive electrical, but on analog signals, if the ground's not good, the signals are going to be skewed. The signal's just not going to read right. You've got to have solid grounds. And so what we'll do is we'll use that stock ground wire. I'll verify good continuity on that, and then we'll bring it back and tie into this, which will then tie the rest of the tank to ground also. Because whenever you have a painted tank stuff, this is an aluminized tank from the looks of it, it probably will get good ground, but you have to remember that we're running anti-vibration insulation on between the metal because we don't want the tank rattling around. But we've got this one hooked up, and so we'll go put the camera in front of the gauge, and then we'll swing this and see if the gauge works for the first time since I've owned the car. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and throw this thing in on, and I saw it move already. Hopefully you guys can see it. This is going to be our fuel gauge. I'm going to go move the sender now. No music. Okay. Okay, yep, I just put it to full, and she moved to full. Now I'm going to move to 50% or so. So we should be pretty close to 50%. We're showing just a smidge underneath, but fuel sinker's good. That means that we're not going to run out of fuel now. Okay, so for setting this thing up for level on your tank, it's pretty straightforward. We're actually going to remove half this bracket and figure out how to, well actually, yeah, it's pretty straightforward. You pop off this bottom bracket, you can then mount the float arm directly to the top bracket, because this tank's not this deep. This bracket's set up to be able to use really deep tanks, and what we want to do is measure out the distance for our pickup through this hole. We want to measure to the bottom of the tank, and then we want to divide that roughly by half. That way, whenever we align this on this pole, we want that halfway mark to be right through the middle of this pivot arm. And so whenever we're at half fuel, this pivot arm will be perpendicular to the mount arm, and that'll give us our halfway level. And then if we set our arm length properly, which we will set based off of how tall we are off of the bottom flange here to the pivot arm, if we set our arm length properly, it will hit max, and it should be right below the mounting surface down here, and then empty should be, because we're right in the middle, right beside where empty would be, or right by the bottom of the gas tank floor. Now, empty is kind of the harder place to hit, and so what I'll probably end up doing is actually short stroking this arm a little bit. Get your jokes in down in the comments below. I'll make the arm a little bit shorter than normal, and by doing that, it will show us empty a little bit sooner than we're actually empty at. So we won't have as much range, and we'll be stuck on full a little bit longer than normal, but these are trade-offs that are worth doing it to make sure that we don't think we have fuel left. I want this thing to read empty, really close to empty. Okay, here's our old arm. We're not going to need that. We'll set this aside real quick. And let's see. We're at 7 inches exactly. That makes it nice. So we can go 3.5 inches for our pivot point. And we'll kind of do the same design here and get all this wrapped up nicely, so whenever we mount this back on here, we'll be good to go. So we're measuring from the bottom of our flange. We want this to be perpendicular, 3.5 inches. We're going to be pretty high up in there. Right about there should be perfect. It's mounted pretty high. Let me get my other screws started in here. We'll tighten them down, and then we'll verify before we lock it down. And that's as close as we're going to get with these set screws, it looks like. This bracket's just super long for this setup. We'll tighten those down. And, you know, we could probably shorten this gray wire up, but I'm not going to worry too much about it. Let me grab a flathead and we'll do the float arm. Okay, back off this lock for that. And obviously this float arm is going to be super long, but what we want to do is get a ram through here, and we want this thing to hit full before it gets to the top. Pretty close to where the flange will be. This flange is not that thick on that setup, so if we were to mount that right about there, that would be full. And what we're looking for then, whenever we tighten this down, we'll have to cut this excess arm off, of course. You want to leave it long enough that it hits the stop back here. But now we should have, see, that's a problem. Well, that's because there's excess on this side. Once we cut this off, that will allow it to go down the other way. But now we should have about 7 inches, because what did we say our tank was 7 inches deep? We should have about 7 inches, come on now. We should have about 7 inches of stroke from the bottom up to the top, which top of the float down to the bottom. So that's pretty close. That's going to get us really accurate. I'm going to zip this off real quick. Okay, now that I've zipped that off, that allows that float to fall back down to empty. And there's our float range. So we should be able to go ahead and feed this thing in. Am I dumb? What am I missing here? Oh, you know what it is. I'm going to have to cut the rest of this bracket off to make room. I'll be right back. Okay, now that I've cut our bracket off, let's see if we can get this thing to fit. We're getting closer. There we go. Okay. We want to pay attention to the orientation of our float. Come on, pop in there. Okay, so we want to go that direction. Oh, surprisingly. Okay, it goes that direction. There's only one way to mount it based on the way the holes are lined up. And we can dig through here, find our hardware for our float. Let me guess, didn't come with screws. Did you not come with screws, kid? Oh, we gotta get a gasket in there too. Yeah, here's the screws. Okay, we'll go ahead and put our cork gasket on here. Find where it lines up. It lines up good there. That's so crazy. I've never seen hole offsetting like that would keep you from being able to install this the wrong direction. That's really inventive. See if we can get one started. You get one of these started, the rest usually fall in place pretty good. Remember, whenever you tighten these down, don't over tighten it. You want to tighten it just enough so this gasket seals, because you don't want to have to come back in here and just nail this thing with silicone if you don't have to. Okay, so our sender is installed. This tank's baffled, which is nice. We're going to have to do the same thing with our pickup or pump mount, which is going to be a tight fit for this pump. We're going to end up cutting most of this off because if we're looking at, once again, this is like 6 3/4 inches. We're going to want to cut below this hanger down here. Let me do that real quick. You know, this is our pickup or our outlet right here. And then this is a vent. Because of our setup though, we got a tank vent and this vent. We'll end up taking this vent off and running a line from here, teeing it onto this, and then it comes with a rollover that will have to be mounted. You want to mount that above your fuel filler for it to be effective. We've shortened this thing up enough. There's our orientation for that. So we'll have our feed, our return, no, our pump, our return, then our vent right there. And we've left 2 notches in the bottom of this in which to mount our pump. And our pump, because we're using the 450, actually has the wider base, and so it'll have to mount below this to mount flush on there, but we'll get that to work as soon as it shows up. It did come with the filler neck with the the rubber. So you have your rubber stick pops on here. Right, you got it. Then you have your filler neck with the standard opening on the other side, whereas the other one had the filler neck hard in there. Now, this will give us a little bit more flexibility of kind of getting this thing clocked right to make sure it's hitting behind our gas tank properly. Okay, coincidentally, our fuel pump literally just showed up. So we'll go ahead and pop the filter on the bottom of this. It's got a lock on it, so just line it up to the hole and push. Helps to center the lock. There we go. And that's not going anywhere. So this has a different connector on it than our fuel hat, but the nice thing about it is this thing's just using a couple stake-ons. So I'm going to take our Aeromotive one that comes with it, and I'll trim it down a little bit because we don't need 6,000 foot worth of connector on there. And I'll connect these up real quick. So what I'm going to have to do is remove this crimp-on connector and use a short section of fuel hose in there in between the barbed fittings on that and the fuel pump. And then, as I said, we need to look at our tank depth of 6 3/4 or so with the gasket, and then we want to measure out our pump mounting location so that it is 6 3/4, and we're just spot on right there. Just the filter pickup is going to be touching the bottom of the tank without bottoming the pump out. I mean, it's about perfect. And so we can get this little hose pup section in there, get that clamped down, and then we'll zip tie these in. And then I got the new connectors on here, so we can just plug our pump right in like so, and we'll be able to install the pump. The tank will be ready to go in. Whew, she's a tight fit. She's a tight fit. But we got the pump mounted on there. Got a little pup of hose in there to make sure that we're connected up good. We want to double check, make sure our connections over here are not going to be touching anything, each other. Specifically, we want to make sure the red doesn't touch the wall of the tank, and we will probably should have put my gasket on beforehand. It might be a tight fit. Nah, it's going to work fine. And this came with a rubber gasket, like a foam gasket, and a cork one. I'm going to go ahead and use the foam gasket because by the time I got the pump mounted on there, we were a little bit close to the bottom. It was maybe touching, maybe not. It was hard to tell, but because we were that close, I decided to go ahead and use the foam gasket because it's going to have a little more offset to make sure that we are not touching. And then we're just going to snake this thing in here because it is so big. We're going to run these longer screws as long as they're the right thread pitch, and I think they are. I'll double check. Yeah, they're the right size and thread pitch, so we're going to run these longer Phillips down through here because we're running this thicker gasket. Okay, once again, we want to snug this stuff down without deforming the gasket too much. We want a good seal, good even seal. But as I said, if you tighten this stuff down too much, it's almost as bad as not tightening it down enough. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and tie the vents together. And luckily I had a 6 3/8 because if I hadn't, I would have been a little bit unhappy because, you know, nothing worse than getting into a project like this and realizing you need something you don't have. So we're just going to, these are vent lines, so we're just going to use zip ties to hold these things on. Probably don't even need to do that since they're all barbed, but we'll go ahead, especially on that one because it might be a little loose. Just throw a zip tie on there, and then what we'll want to do is we'll come in here, tee off of this, tie into those two, and then we'll run this one over to our rollover valve. Okay, I think the tank is ready to go back in. I gotta get a couple things out of the way, and then we can set the tank down underneath the car, start kind of checking out our hoses. We gotta get our fuel filter installed, so we'll come off of our pump and into a fuel filter pretty close by here, down in this area. But let me get that stuff kind of sorted out and we'll install this thing. As is common here in the garage, we do not have enough hose. Pretty typical. So what we're going to go ahead and do is run the return line because we're going to be putting a filter on our feed, and that means we can go ahead and get the tank installed. We can drop the filter in on the feed, get it up, mounted. Then all we have to do is run the feed line from the pump and tie it into the filter side of it. And so that'll be coming tomorrow, which is fine because we weren't going to get everything buttoned up tonight. So that's pretty much it for getting our EFI tank done. All we have to do is throw the straps in there, bolt this thing into place. I've got my ground wire right here. I've got my power wires ran underneath, my power wire for my pump, and then my fuel level sender wire are up in there. And then we got to mount our vent somewhere, so I'll probably build a little bracket. And I've got a little plate where my pump, my electric carbureted fuel pump was, that I could probably just build a little bracket off this and mount that right there, and it should be higher than our fill like we need, so everything will be kind of out of the way. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up. The next video that you see will be firing this thing up, because after this thing's in place, we're going to have one fuel line to run. And of course, I also ordered the wrong fuel clamps for mounting the fuel line, so I'll have to, those will be here tomorrow also. So we'll get all that knocked out, finish setting up the distributor, and then we're going to fire this thing up. We'll walk through the steps on the Holley Sniper touchscreen. We're going to use the touchscreen, kind of use the wizard to set this thing up. And then after that, we'll dive into using the actual software to get into the more advanced features. So got plenty of work to do. You guys know the drill. Thanks for stopping by the garage. Remember, ABT, always be tuning.